by thinking about political systems and what systems are, how we identify systems. And so the reason for this is that states are political systems, but within so systems can be many things. And so as we shall see later on, they could be judicial, they could be legislative. In other words, the state is often defined as an organism that comprises of systems, procedures, principles, things that are organized. And I think one of the ways to think about this is think of the body as a system. It works together. If parts of the bodies are not working together, then we kind of have issues. So when we think about systems as ordered, comprehensive assemblage of things, not just facts or principles, doctrines, but we're thinking of states or systems as broader things. And it is true that states can comprise of principles, doctrines. So, for example, if you think about Saudi Arabia, it is a state. It is a theocratic state. And so when we say a theocracy, what are the characteristics of a theocracy? What are the arrangements of such a system? And so we want to think about states. There are very few states that don't have systems within them. However much we disagree with them, they are all systems. And so how they interact with each other to produce laws, to produce actions, inactions, functions, and so on. So these are what we are thinking about as systems. And so there are many people who have talked about systems, including, for example, Malinowski. And so it's important to, here we are thinking about, for example, social structural rather than biological, even though there are people who can see the state as divided into biological, symbolic. So, and we're going to see some examples of symbolic. But so the state is an integrated, functioning organism. So, for example, for most of us, if someone treads on your freedoms, rights, or visits violence on you, there are places, people, institutions that you can appeal to. So we know, we are socialized to know these parts of a state. If, for example, you're looking for ways to fund your education, you know what system to go to. If your grades don't show up as they should, you know what system to go to. So these are the kinds of things that we are talking about. And so there are very many systems. Some of them are necessary for the functioning of the state, and some are just basic. And so for example, Easton, he talks about systems theory. And so if you're thinking about politics, what is a political system more broadly? What does a political system do? And I'm sure you've run into the definition of politics as who gets what, when, where, how, and all those kinds of things. What allows the who to decide what people get? So, for example, on the 20th of January, there was a changeover in government systems. Now, people expected that the new incoming government would have appointed people to continue certain functions. And so we can look at this as authoritative functions, allocation of not just values, but also resources. Who gets what resources? So, for example, one of the questions that has engaged the American body politic is the question of who is in charge of Doge and how do we know? What are the appointive systems. If someone was appointed, how would we know? Like, what are the communicative systems that we would know? And so when we think about the body politic, it's a created organism that borrows from existing systems. So just like we have, like our bodies will work with each other, and some days we wake up and we're like, today I'm not feeling it, my whole body is refusing. Political systems can also find these dissociations. And some of the ways we see this is, for example, when there's violence, political violence, when there's rebellion. But more broadly, the political system has certain functions. It's very rare so for example, think about being pulled over by the police. Most of us will pull over because we acknowledge those. We may not we may not agree with them, but we acknowledge the authority system. Now, of course, there are questions of justice and those kinds of things that we shall talk about in a different class. But there's this authoritative nature of systems that we accede to. Now, of course, people do occasionally disagree with systems and violate agreed upon tenets or ways of doing things or being. And so it's important to sort of think about ourselves as parts of the political system, as acknowledging its authority, as political systems bringing together a collective. And so political systems will do certain things. So, for example, it's going to inculcate values. I think most of us would agree that we acknowledge this to be a democracy, representative democracy. And by going to elect our representatives, we acknowledge that value of representation. Now, of course, there are people who think that maybe we should have maybe direct democracy like in Switzerland, and that we should be voting on a lot of legislation, that maybe those who represent us represent themselves more than they represent us, but these are functions of this system. But there's also allocation both from the public but also from the government. So, for example, right now we are in the middle of dismantling government, and one could argue that that's a choice we've made. By electing the people we've elected. Now, of course, there are people who think that maybe that's not the choice we've made, but also, again, we accept those decisions as binding. And when we do not, there are ways to contest those decisions. So, for example, the courts are one of the ways in which this contestation or the contestation of the authority is manifested. Soon there's going to be elections that also become a way of suggesting whether we agree with the direction of government or not. But nobody is necessarily taking up arms and going to fight other people, because we accept the way the system works, the authority in this collective. And so when we sort of think about political systems, they have demands, supports, and what Easton calls conversions. And so outputs can be different from outcomes, because outputs can be, well, what you put out, but what comes out might be different things. So, for example, when we think about outcomes, or outputs, like we employ people to change or to, so for example, this particular government is talking about shrinking the budget and spending. But what are the outcomes that we are seeing, and are all of them necessarily intended? I want to point to a recent maybe outcome that was unintended. For example, the firing of the National Nuclear Safety Administration, which are the people who design nuclear weapons and work for the Department of Energy. And then the government going, whoops, that wasn't what we intended to do. Now, those are outcomes that are, I think, unintended. And so when we sort of think about the impacts of the decisions that we have made as a political system, sometimes they can be really, and so for example, during this period, we are beginning to ask ourselves, are these the outcomes we really wanted? Are these, how is, and even things that we are not necessarily thinking about, for example, what does dismantling the Department of Education do? What are some of the impacts that that's going to have? But again, very soon we are going to begin to see the feedback loop of some of these practices. So we see government doing things and then we see feedback. So sometimes feedback is negative, sometimes it can be positive. But so when we sort of think about politics, and especially in this country, we see very interesting. So whenever a new government comes into office, particularly this one, and it has articulated that it has a mandate to change government, then in maybe the next 2 years, we are going to see whether this was actually true. Now, the question is whether there will be enough government to, but so we have to think about how political systems persist. Now, until now, there hasn't been these kinds of rapid changes. So there is some static nature to the political system, but there's also elements of change. And so Easton sort of talks about the demands into the political system and then the feedback loop, actions and decisions. And so here we can see some of those decisions, actions, and then the feedback. So you've seen people in congressional districts expressing their disagreement with whatever is going on and arguing that this is not what they voted for. So again, this is a system that has feedback, it has inputs, it has outputs, and it has impacts. And so inputs rather can be demand for allocation of goods and services. Where do we allocate goods and services? So for example, should the US be giving money to less wealthy countries? Should it be funding US aid? So how do we allocate goods? Where should allocation of goods and services go? There are other inputs. So for example, public safety acts. So again, in this, I think we are living in a period of time where we can really see these examples. So for example, public safety acts. The idea that the US is overrun by migrants who are criminals and that they should be removed, is that necessarily the truth? But also choices that the government makes. So for example, to find individuals who may fall into those categories, and so those would become public safety acts and rules. Now there are other rules that are maybe not so much the purview of government. So for example, rules of marriage, health, sanitation, this can be the domain of local governments rather than but again, I want us to think about government as expansively. So there's local government, there's national government, there's regional governments, there is other types of government. So for example, school districts are examples of a type of government. Now, there's then a demand for participation in the political system. So, registration of voters, setting of elections, determining the rules of elections. So, for example, there are bills currently going through various legislatures that are intending to set the rules. So, for example, should people produce evidence of citizenship while they register? And so these are elements of demands of participation. But there are, again, as we mentioned, there are other types of participation. So giving to political parties or canvassing or even attending protests. These are examples of demand for participation in the political system. Demand for communication and information, and we're going to see some of this and how sometimes the government signals in terms of communication. So when we think about inputs, these are four of the major inputs that Easton has identified. Now, of course, there are other political scientists who might have a different way of seeing this. In terms of support, he talks about material support. So, for example, we pay taxes. Well, I don't think many people have a choice, but that becomes an example of support for the state. Military service. So most males, for example, under the age of 26 are required to register for selective services. This is a demand for support. If there ever was maybe a war, then there might be a draft. And so if you look at countries that are, for example, right now experiencing war, like Ukraine or Russia, and so I want you to think of these supports or these political systems, not just in the United States, but across the world. Support for the regime also requires obedience of law, rules, and regulations. Now, maybe that is not necessarily, I wonder if most people obey the law because if they don't, then they might be in trouble, or because they think it's the right thing to do, or because the government says to do so, or because there's some kind of consequence for not doing so. So think about speeding. It's good to not speed because it's good to drive safe, but there's also consequence for not doing that. And so according to Easton, again, we are saying that there are other perspectives to this. Obedience to laws, regulations is an example of support for a political system. Now, of course, voting and political discussion, but also paying attention to government communication or display of differences, or respect to public authority, symbols, and ceremonials. So again, I want you to keep in mind that there are three elements to David Easton's political systems. There are inputs, supports, and outputs. Now, in terms of outputs, he talks about extractions. So the political system extracts from its citizens or publics. People pay taxes, and even when we don't necessarily think we pay taxes, we go shopping and we pay certain types of taxes. Regulation of behavior. Our behavior is regulated, and there are punishments, rewards, and so on. But also allocation of goods and opportunities. So, for example, people who are rewarded with, for example, presidential medals or congressional medals of honor, these are examples of honors. Now, in terms of goods, there are allocations. For example, if you think about people who become ambassadors, now there are two classes of ambassadors, especially for the US, and most of these are political appointees. You give money to the regime or to the president and his party, and so you get rewarded with some ambassadorship. For example, I think it was Mrs. McCain, who was an ambassador to like Hungary or something, appointed by President Biden. So these are examples of allocation of goods, but also this allocation of goods for the country. The display of national flag, communication of policy and intent, and more than maybe everywhere else, the US is very good at the display of flags and this kind of communication. So these outputs that we are talking about as displays of authority items A few weeks ago, I don't know how much you pay attention to these kinds of things, but and I don't know if anyone saw this. This was Daytona 500, which is absolutely a race in which people make endless left turns. And so the question is, why would the Air Force One be there? But not just at Daytona 500. Think about football games. Why is the national anthem played? Why is trooping of colors? Why does that occur? Why are there fighter jets flying over a football game? This is, now some people call it indoctrination, other people call it precisely what Easton is talking about: display of national flag, communication of policy intent. Now, one of the criticisms about this display was that the president flew from Palm Springs to Daytona, which apparently is very close. And so is this a waste of resources? Apparently it cost about $25,000. Was it necessary? Now, of course, the people who are there were, enjoyed, I don't know what they were enjoying, but now this was another part of the display of or the communication of intent. The beast led the first lap of, and so it's sort of like, why are we doing this? Now, of course, this is very powerful, and many other presidents have done this, so I'm not even digging this particular president. But so think about how we communicate national priorities, intents, how we display flags, how we, even things like graduations, even on Norfolk State University campus. So this is Easton's idea of the display of the national flag, the communication of policy, or communication of what the nation generally is. Now, there are other similar displays in other places. So, for example, this in Kashmir, which is in India, or, well, Pakistan, it's disputed. Soldiers, like this display of national pride through the military. And so this is Indian and Pakistani troops basically marching past each other. And clearly you can see there are people who are, watching at the Wagah border. Now, both countries have nuclear weapons. But so again, you might think that that would be enough, and that they didn't need to strut each other across a border that is disputed and over which they've gone to war with each other. But these are examples of David Easton's communication of the national, what the nation is, what it imagines itself to be. And so it's important to sort of think about how we see the political system as based on inputs, supports, outputs, the conversion of this into policies and actual outcomes that have both economic, social, ecological, and other implications. And so think about how states are formed, why they're established, what their purposes are, how they symbolize or they signal what they are, and how they rope in all of the rest of us to buy into that whole national project. Now, I want us to move on to thinking about, so we've seen what nations are, we've seen what states are, how they are created, how they are imagined. Now, what kind of institutions and structures are found in these nations? And as different as they are, it is true that each nation has institutions political institutions. It has institutional structures. And for the most part, some look like each other. So most countries will have executives, they will have legislatures, they will have um, judiciaries. Now, whether these judiciaries are based on religion or are based on common law or are based on a mixture of both, it's important to think about the political institutions that are found in each nation. And so these, again, are negotiations by each national or by the polity. So you will have the executives, the legislature, the administrative systems, and so a lot of the times you'll see political administrative systems being conflated with the executive. So for most systems, there will be three levels of these kinds of systems. Now, in some countries, there is religion becomes another significant element. Now, this country has decided that it's going to be secular, and so it is not the role of religion is not as important, even though there are these descriptions of this country as a Judeo-Christian nation. Now, what that necessarily means is, up to interpretation, but I want you to think about the executive branches, the legislature, the judicial systems, and I should probably add that legislatures can be bicameral, so two chambers of legislature, or unicameral, which is usually one chamber. Yeah, the US is a bicameral system. Kyrgyzstan is a unicameral. Not sure why I know that, but so executives, legislatures, and again, administrative systems are often conflated with executives. So, for example, in this country, there's currently a major debate over whether the administrative systems are part of the executive and whether the executive can vary how these are administered. So when we think about executives, what is the role of the executive? So a lot of their role is leadership. And so we can look at the executive in a country as the chief executive who is in charge of implementation of the laws that have been designed. So they are essentially the head of the administrative system. So they will carry out the political system. Again, think the political system. They carry out the policies, the laws, the directives, changes, modifications, some that we like and others that we probably don't. And so they do provide leadership that formulates and implements these goals. But they act as a symbol, a unifying symbol. And as we just saw, so for example, if you think about Air Force One, that is a symbol of the presidents and the other symbols. So for example, the White House is another symbol. And so there are these symbols of the nation. Now, I want to point to the difference here between the internal politics of a nation and the external politics. So here, where we talk about the unifying symbol, this is not necessarily always true. So, for example, in the US, internally, we know that this country is clearly very divided. But and this is really a really good example. So this morning, not sure if you are paying attention or you about it, but tariffs went into effect against Mexico, China, and Canada. Now, China, Canada, and Mexico are in the process of retaliating. So they didn't say we are going to impose tariffs on Republicans. They're imposing tariffs against the United States. Now, we talked about the nation being unitary, unitary rational actor, even when there's no rationality. So nobody thinks, well, some people think tariffs are a good idea. Most everyone else is like, this is a terrible idea. But so from internally, you can see the division, but externally, people think of the United States. If you saw that situation on Friday, people are not saying, people are saying the United States did. So, unifying symbol, if for outsiders who are like, that's what the United States is doing now, that's the United States. Now, internally here, you might be like, that's them. So, unifying symbol, yeah. But if you think of other countries, like if you think of Canada, not sure how often you think about Canada, but you think of Justin Trudeau. You don't think about, like how many different parties there are and whether they are having they are supposed to have an election soon. But you think of Canada, you don't think about the divisions. You think of the United Kingdom. Now there you might say the king and the parliament, but we think of those countries as united. We think of China. We don't even think of China and Hong Kong. So unifying symbol or symbol of unity, supervision of administration, and it sets broad guidelines, including taking them down. So, for example, now, what is DOGE? Who is in charge? What is it doing? Can it have your private information? That is part of the unitary nature of the state. Supervision of the military and foreign affairs. Now, I like to point out the differences between the US and other countries. So, for example, in the US, there's this interesting division of authority between the president and Congress. So the president is the commander in chief. But so he can declare war or end a war. But the Congress is the one that appropriates money, including to fight wars. Now, I don't know anyone who can fight wars without money. And so this is a very unusual division. In other countries, the president declares war and says, go fight someone. But in many other countries, and again, I'm making the point that we are talking about global governments. The supervision of the military or foreign affairs, the chief executive is, this is part of his role. Now, the question of the head of state and head of government, this can be two things, but they can also be the same thing, depending. So, for example, and this is what we are saying, it depends on the kind of regime. So there are what we call unitary regimes, where, so for example, the US doesn't have a monarchy. Now, in some monarchies, the monarch is is both the head of state and head of government. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the head of state is also the head of government. In the United States, the head of state is also the head of government. In Canada, UK, New Zealand, maybe the Netherlands, Belgium, the head of state is the monarch. And so, like the embodiment of the United Kingdom or of Canada is the king. There's a government that is elected. And so that is, so the head of government in this case would be the prime minister. So these are maybe non-unitary regimes, but in the US, it's a unified regime, so the head of state is the head of government. So when the US goes or is at a meeting, the president or their representative is the person who we think of. Now, and so if you sort of think of, this is a picture from a few years ago, many years ago, 2018, the leaders of the G20, which is the group of 20. I'm not sure if many of these are still in office. Yeah, some are, like him. This is the Chinese president. Oh, he's back in power. Him, French president. I think this was the Philip, not, yeah, Philip, maybe. So there are leaders can be the heads of state or heads of government. So, for example, he's the head of state and head of government, head of state and head of government. This is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He is technically the head of government, but the head of state is his father, King Salman. So that's another unitary regime, but for practical purposes, he runs government. And so it's useful to sort of think about these distinctions. Hey, how was he there, the Rwandese president? This is what we are talking about: dual executive, fused executive, yeah, head of state, head of government. Again, the US head of state is the head of government. The British, the head of state is whoever is the king or queen or royal. The fused executive is the same person has both roles. And so this is more common in around the world, other than kingdoms. And even kingdoms, it's only some of those. And so the executive is basically everyone who is below the chief executive in the structure. Hierarchical, the president is the... Now there are, of course, there are checks and balances, even within, for example, the executive. So individuals who are, for example, ombudsman, or well, I think it's just ombudsman, or inspector generals who have tenure. These are usually, generally can only be removed for cause. So you can't just wake up one day and decide they are from the previous, they were appointed by the previous government, so I'm going to fire them. And so this is actually one of those official office of the special counsel, the issue that came about and making its way through the courts. But so it's important to sort of think about most governments are run by the chief executive, who is also generally the president. Now, this is an example of the head of state and head of government. So here's head of government, head of state, no, head of government, head of state. Prime minister, head of government. The king is the head of state. Now, there are roles for which, and so, for example, with the British, it's actually very odd, because the parliament, so for example, he is the head of the Labour Party, and so last year they won the elections, blowout. But he had to go to the king to ask for permission to form government. And so these are some of those sort of traditions that are often done within systems. I mean, I would think that he would form government, but they also have other roles. For example, this is the opening of parliament in July 2024. So the king and queen open parliament. Um, Anyone know who opens the US parliament? Yeah, when it convenes. For example, this year there was it convened, the new Congress convened on the 3rd of January. Usually, anyone? No, no. Speaker. So the Speaker of Parliament. So again, you know, there are different ways in which regimes or countries will do these kinds of things, but it's important to sort of figure out who in different countries who is what. Anyone know who the head of state of Canada is? Head of state. Is the prime minister not the head of government?
No, no. Do they have a governor general? They have a governor general?
They have a governor general, but would the governor general be the head of state?
Well, they'll be the representative for the king.
So they would be the correct answer would be the king, right?
Yeah, but that's the
Represented by the governor.
the governor general.
Yes,
Represents the king.
yes.
So,
But so they wouldn't say they still wouldn't say it's a governor general.
uh,
They'd still say it's the king.
because Jamaica has one, and we used to say like,
Wait, didn't you get rid of him?
no, we still have the governor general.
So your head of state is the king?
We would say
Well,
so.
actually, it is
We have a
because
governor general and a prime minister.
yes, didn't who came the other year? Was it William and Kate?
Yeah,
And there were a bit of protests, maybe.
but I mean, they've been saying like to get away from that because we still use the privy court
Yeah.
in England as our highest court, which doesn't make sense because we're independent.
Are you though? See, I think this is a very interesting discussion that has been going on, especially with Caribbean nations, and why the king is still. Um, it's another debate that goes on over the Commonwealth and why countries would associate with the people who colonized them. But yeah, so the head of, I'm now curious if the head of state of Jamaica is the king. Because if you have a governor general who is a representative of the king, I thought,
But we wouldn't recognize that. We recognize that as prime minister.
so then maybe you got rid of the
Prime minister
king.
calls the shots. The governor general doesn't really do anything. Really. It's just because Jamaica has been an independent country since 1962. So when we have, should be no reason why we have a governor general because we are no longer tied to England. Right?
Yes.
Ask me why there is one. I don't know.
So in this the question of practicalities versus what should be. So for example, I think even countries like Canada, they've been independent since like 18 something, but they still have a governor general. Um, but it's actually interesting. Look up whether the head of state of Jamaica is the king. But those countries that would have, and so again, there are these discussions of why do you have a monarch who is 3,000 miles away and what do they do? But importantly, that is kind of the issue of, or the difference between the head of state and head of government, or where the head of state is also the head of government. unified executive or divided executive. Now, the other second part of the state administrative apparatus is the legislatures, which make laws. Now, I will say that it is found in every country, even though in places like Saudi Arabia, it really has no role. Like, it's supposed to advise, but if your constitution is the Quran, what other laws are you making? So found in nearly every country, but it's in some places it's not really functional. As I mentioned, in the US, it's two houses, so this is what we call the bicameral legislature, upper house and lower house. So, for example, the UK has an upper house and lower house. The House of Representative, or actually Parliament, and the House of Lords. The US, of course, has the Congress and the Senate. Yeah, so countries go back and forth about whether they should have one House of Parliament or of legislature, or two. Now, for example, in the UK, the upper house really has no work. It's like rich people who are made into lords, and so they sit around and not sure what they do. For most parliaments or legislatures, they enact legislation and sort of figure out, or if, for example, you have changes in constitutions, they can initiate those changes or validate those changes. So, for example, changes in the US Constitution can be done one of two ways. They can originate in the Congress, or they can originate as state legislatures, three-quarters of them agreeing on like an amendment, and then they'll be voted on in Congress. So appropriation is the dividing up of the money, what government is going to use. So appropriation becomes one of the significant responsibilities, and so they divide the money and how the government is going to use the money. They also decide on taxation. So they are essentially the representation of citizenry. So people are, and so most people, most citizens, and again, the legislative systems are different. So, for example, in the UK, or even in the US, citizens are in a constituency, or in the case of the US, we call these districts. Now, in some other systems, for example, in France or Germany, you vote both for the legislator, but you also vote for the party. And so there's like party representation and also representation by your legislator. And some legislatures have like thresholds. So these are citizens in a constituency, people who vote for the legislator, most dominant groups. So, for example, if you go to the South, you'll find that most conservatives dominate lots of these constituencies. But these people also belong to political parties. And so if you sort of think about voting, so for example, recently there was a budget resolution that was passed by the US Congress, passed 217 to 215. And so that is voting by political party, and they are, of course, voting for a budget resolution for the country. So legislatures are the lawmaking, appropriating bodies. Most countries have them. Some countries do not. And people take voting seriously. So other than maybe the United States, where voting day is not public holiday, except in Virginia, most other places, voting day is usually a public holiday. In Kenya, for example, it's a Tuesday. So no school, no work, everything is shut down. People can go vote. In some countries, voting is voting is compulsory. There are questions of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We saw how it sometimes increases voter turnout, but there's a question of whether people should be required to vote. So legislatures have other roles. So, for example, oversight of the executive. Like sometimes executives will do things, and legislature goes back and passes laws that undo what the legislature is or the executive is doing. In the case of the US, for example, the upper house provides advice and consent. So people who are in senior government roles are grilled and then they are voted on by the Senate. And this is true of many other places. They can change government. But also sometimes they have ombudsman, and so they can investigate and report on issues. They can scrutinize executive performance, but also investigative power. So, for example, when you hear hearings before Congress, this is usually investigating what has been done. Now, sometimes they are just there's a bit of foolishness that goes on in these hearings. For example, whether wildfires in California were caused by Jewish space lasers. Like, what? Now, as I mentioned, they can be bicameral or they can unicameral, one chamber or two chambers. They vary widely. So, in places where they only have one, it usually it's the directly elected by the people. Now, of course, the people who elect these houses of legislatures depend. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, it's only the men who vote. So, again, is that necessary representative? The US case, the Senate is the upper house, 2 senators per state. House of Representative has actually 438 members. 435 are based on districts, and 3 represent DC and I think Puerto Rico. So there are questions of whether the legislature is declining, particularly if you think about the US, this particular season. Yeah, but we shall stop here today. On Thursday, we shall talk about administrative systems, but also the